Hi everyone, welcome to Isamu Rat Care. So today I wanted to do a bit of a video about coat condition and about how you can judge things off a rat. So I mentioned it briefly in my last video and a couple of people picked up on it and said it's something they really wanted to hear about. So what is coat condition and why does it matter? So coat condition is all about how shiny, kind of healthy, short their coat is. Seems fairly self-explanatory. The reason it's important is because the way they kind of molt out of their coat and the kind of mechanism behind that tells you about their nutrition. So the first thing to think about is that every single hair on that rat's head has its own little life cycle. It lives for so long and it'll get to an age where it starts getting a bit old, and like with everything in life, it has its time and it drops out and is replaced by a new one, and actually the act of the new one going through forces the old one out. So it's quite important in terms of the hair's life cycle that the new one is ready when the old one's feeling a bit old and tired and past its best. So that kind of time scale varies quite a lot. And it varies from around about 4 to 6 or 8 weeks, depending where on the rat's body it is. Let me borrow a kind of example here. So if you're talking about around the head area, that's where the fastest growth occurs, and the kind of slowest growth, so effectively the oldest hairs on the bodies, kind of is along the rump here. Hey, little snuffkin. And that means that when we have issues with the coat, it's in the rump we tend to see it first. So Mog has a few long hairs now. I don't know if it'll show particularly well, but what I will do is I will put some pictures up as I go along to describe it. So what are the kind of problems that you can see in a coat that's kind of condition? And by condition I mean diet related generally. Sometimes condition can also be down to kind of environment as well, I should say. It's a quite complicated piece, but it's something that's quite important and quite useful to you in terms of working out what's going on with the rat. So we know that each hair has this kind of life cycle. So the first major issue you see with the hair is when some of the hairs are kind of dropping out and others aren't. So this is kind of like molt. When rats are young, I wonder if Stuff can demonstrate this. No, you're not in molt at the moment. I will put up a picture of a really good molt. The example here is a rat that you can see kind of patches of different colour on it, and that happens when new kind of hair is growing through, and that new hair is normally darker, kind of richer, healthier hair, and it will show through. It shows up particularly well in minks actually. If you've got a mink based rat, they're always patchy as hell. Let's see, have you got a molt mark? Nope, never mind. Yeah, so you see this molt, and you'll see the different patches of the rats, and it's new hair versus old hair, quite simple. In itself, it's not saying that there's a problem, but what you can have is a rat can get what we call stuck in molt. So stuck in molt is when they're kind of like part of the way through the molt, but the hairs don't have enough of the nutrients to push the old hairs out, so instead they've got like a load of kind of old hairs around their rump. And that shows as quite long, sometimes dull looking hairs, quite fluffy, sticking out around the rump. And as the rat gets kind of more and more into this, if you don't sort it out quickly, then gradually this kind of like old hair effect will move further and further backwards, and it can look quite they can look quite scruffy, and the coat doesn't feel good. It feels kind of a bit dry, a bit tatty, you know, and that's all a sign. It's just this old hair that's very ready to kind of get itself gone and be replaced by the new stuff. And that usually specifically happens due to protein deficiency. So protein is a vital element in any rat, and this is why you quite often see it in young rats. It basically helps them grow. It produces muscles, it does all sorts of bits and pieces, but it also is involved in the hair. So the new hair needs protein because it's mostly made out of that to kind of form into this nice little pretty hair, as well as it needing pigment, etc., which we'll get onto later on. So you kind of get the hairs looking a bit scruffy, and most of the time, if that's happening, you've probably got a deficiency in protein. So you try and give them a couple of extra wet protein meals. By wet protein, I mean like a decent wet dog food, or scrambled egg, or chicken, or something like that. Something quite high in protein that's good for them. Fish is another good one. Watch the tuna. Don't feed that more than about once every couple of weeks with the mercury levels. And don't feed anything too salty or too oily. So nothing in brine, nothing in oil, but that gives you kind of ideas. So that helps a lot. Sometimes with the kind of longer coat as well, it can be fat related, so oils. A lot of people think, oh no, oils in the diet, that'll make them fat. It doesn't make them fat, but what it can do is if they have the wrong oils in the diet, they can get quite a dry coat. So that will not look shiny. So when you look at a good rat, let's see if Tato will cooperate. Come here, Missy. So if you notice, Tato, and actually most of my rats, generally have quite a nice shine to their coat. It probably doesn't show out great in this thing, but if I move them around, it's got a nice sheen. Now, I sadly don't have a rat here at the moment. Well, sadly, quite glad I don't have a rat that looks a bit dull, other than my Velvet, and that doesn't really count because her coat doesn't shine in that kind of way. But that kind of shiny hue that you see on a rat coat, when that's missing, sometimes it can be saying that they're a little bit short on your oils and such in the diet, and it's not one particular oil necessarily. Sometimes it's all of them. So we've got omega-3, 6 and 9 as kind of your typical oils. I would say most commonly though it's a shortage in omega-3 oils, which is found in some of your really nice seeds, and actually a bit of fish as well, and that can lead to problems with kind of a dull coat, dry coat. Dandruff's another one. So if you see little white specks in a rat's coat, it's either lice eggs or it's dandruff. Lice eggs stick, dandruff shakes off. That's a kind of a rough guide. I should also mention that dandruff in bucks can also be orange, or in some does that freakishly have buck grease. It's to do with the kind of the way the testosterone kind of affects the oil. It makes it quite a kind of orange colour in kind of dominant bucks. You tend to notice it when they get a little bit older, and when they do have kind of dry skin, you can often find the dandruff has turned orange. Looks suspiciously like lice when you're looking at it from a distance. When you look close, it's actually a little flat disc and it doesn't move, and lice do move. So that gives you a good guide. So that's one of the things that you can kind of think of. So that covers kind of dry fur, and we've looked at kind of long, kind of fluffy coats. One of the other things we've got, and I could do with Mog for this. Come here, Missy. Conveniently not far away. So, rusting. This is particularly obvious in black rats. Mog was rusty as hell when she had her last litter, but if you can see there's a brownish hue to her coat, particularly around the rump, that you can see, and it usually shows up quite well underneath, though she's not bad to be honest. But there's definitely a kind of brownish, kind of patchy quality to her rump. Rusting is basically where the dark cut pigment starts turning brown, and it can happen in any colour. It shows up very well on blacks. Russian blues is another classic one, British blues, minks. You don't tend to notice it on agoutis in the same way because ultimately they're brownish anyway, so there's not as much of the black pigment to rust, though in reality an agouti hair is made up of various colours, but the tip is black, and it's very likely that that black also rusts in the same way. It's just we don't notice it amidst all the lovely colour that they've got. So rusting is basically black turning brown, whether that be in the grey and turning brown or the kind of mingled in another colour. So what causes rusting? Rusting's quite a complicated one. It's caused by a number of factors. Probably the main one is actually genetics, and there's only so much you can do to control that other than kind of breeding and selecting for it. But there is a dietary element as well, and it's all to do with copper. Rusting can be a sign of a copper deficiency, or it can actually be a sign that a rat needs more copper than the other rats in the group. So you can generally be feeding a high copper diet, but actually they need more at that time. One thing I found with Mog is when she had a litter, and this is not abnormal in black rats, she suddenly needed more copper, and whilst I was throwing it to, obviously the babies were draining stuff out of her fairly fast too, and that does happen. She had a few babies to raise. So copper, high copper foods are things like liver is like the number one. You do have to be somewhat careful with liver because it's very high in vitamin A, so you don't want to feed it more than, let's say, once a week. But you can also give things like dried mushrooms are actually very high in copper weight for weight, but not all rats like them. Kind of dark green leafy greens, barley rings, which is partly why I add them to my mix, and conditioning cubes. In fact, a lot of dog kibbles are quite high, but they're obviously high in protein as well, so you have to be somewhat kind of careful about what you feed. But it's always worth, when you see your rat being rusty, try upping the copper. If that doesn't work, then it's not a copper deficiency. But it's one to rule out first, because whilst it affects the coats, in theory it can affect other things as well. So copper deficiency, and we've talked about genetics. One of the other things is apparently sunlight exposure. If they get a lot of sunlight, they can get quite rusty. However, I've heard some people have said that their rats have been rusty as hell when they've moved somewhere dark, and they've been better when they've been out in the sun. So that's an interesting reflection that goes against kind of the normal kind of perceptions. Other things that it can be age. It is quite natural. Like the chocobo, that is my mouth. Yeah, it's quite natural for rats as they get older to rust, and their body becomes less good at processing nutrients. The kidneys kind of get a little bit rusty in their own right. So a little bit of rusting is perfectly natural as a rat ages. I wouldn't worry about it. If I had a 2-year-old black rat and it was rusty, it's 2 years old, you know, give it a chance. Its body's focusing on other things other than beautiful black plumage. If I had a 2-month-old rat that was rusting, that would be much more serious, and there's obviously kind of degrees in between, but generally if they're under about 6 months to a year-ish, you don't really want to see too much rusting. You want to kind of dig into that a bit more than kind of an old rat. So that is another of the kind of coat condition issues you might see. I briefly mentioned lice and such, so parasites do come into it. I wouldn't say that's a condition issue as much as a health issue, but in a way condition is health. But I'm focusing on more the stuff that you wouldn't treat medicinally, which you would treat lice medicinally. I should do a programme on lice and parasites really at some point. It's a common one. Right, so another issue that you might see, so we've talked about a dry coat. You can also get quite an oily coat as well. So an oily coat, sometimes it can vary how it looks, but sometimes the rat looks almost wet. This is more common in bucks, and sometimes the rat just kind of, the coat feels sticky. It's really unpleasant. I've had a few, and I've been judging, particularly the kind of sticky. They sometimes like have dandruff and a really oily coat at the same time, and they're thinking, well, how the hell are you managing that? That actually tends to be what I'd call a fat imbalance. So it tends to be that they've got a lot of certain types of fat in their diet, and I find this particularly with your really low quality poultry fat type diets. So stuff like rat nuggets rely on poultry fat, and some of the coat conditions I've seen have been pretty shocking, particularly in the boys, and felt. Feel comes into it. So that's a lack of the kind of omega-3 oils, and you give them a bit of that and it kind of evens things out, and then they look a lot more healthy. And actually just sack the nuggets, they're a real crap diet anyway. They're not good for them. So that kind of comes into it, the kind of sticky coat feel. One thing I should mention as well on the dry coats, sometimes that's down to humidity. So rats actually naturally need more humidity than we do. We quite like our houses fairly dry now, but the rats kind of naturally came from countries where it's a little bit more humid, so that's how they've evolved. And if it gets a bit dry, it will affect their condition. It will also affect their kind of health and well-being as well. You find you've got more respiratory issues when it gets like either really dry or really, really humid. You don't want a rat to have a bad respiratory problem when it's humid. It's horrible for them, really hard for them to breathe. But yeah, that comes into things as well. So those are kind of condition problems with the coat. I suspect I've missed some, so I'm just kind of ad-libbing it here. So what do we want to look for in a good coat? So we want a kind of that gleam to it. You want something that in an ideal world looks almost polished. Now I should say coat varieties like Velvet, Rex, that kind of thing, they're not going to show it in the same way. Sometimes you can tell by looking at certain areas on them, like generally speaking their fur is quite often flatter around the head, and you can see if it's got a sheen. And if you're used to dealing with those varieties, you can tell by the kind of feel and the kind of look of the quality of the coat. But if you're new to it, you're not going to find it very easy. So you can actually look a bit at the skin as well, and the skin, if it's dry, it will show it by being a little dandruffy, as I've mentioned, but also kind of it feels different. It's really hard to kind of describe feelings on kind of a video, but it does. So you want that kind of like nice feel. In fact, like a perfect smooth coated rat, if they're in great condition, as you stroke them, your hand just glides. It's like stroking silk. It's beautiful. The coat should also be fairly short. Now some of that is breeding, so a well-bred rat will generally have a slightly shorter coat than a rat that hasn't been well-bred, because it's something that breeders do sometimes to select for. But that doesn't mean that a kind of rat from a pet shop, for instance, can't have a short, kind of dense, good coat. It's just they don't tend to care, so they select for whatever. Some varieties are slightly more prone to long coats, like Roans and Siamese and such. but that does vary a lot on the lines. But you do want a nice sheen to it. You want nice and short. Tato's showing off her nice coat at the moment. In fact, it is in pretty good condition, really. It should feel smooth, it should feel nice to the hand, not just that kind of sheen, but it shouldn't feel kind of fluffy and dry. When you brush it kind of the other way, there should be resistance to it, unless you're talking about velvet wrap, which is a completely different matter. So it's all about that kind of quality feel to it, and it is really important. It's a really good sign, and it's a really quick sign to see what's going on rat internally. If you're noticing the coat going out of condition, it's time to kind of ask yourself, right, what's going on in the diet, what's going in their environment, what can I try to change? And I will say, with fixing all condition issues, a lot of it is trying something, giving it a couple of weeks, seeing what happens. So like I said with the coat, the molting time's between 4 and 6 weeks, but if they're stuck in molt, they're ready to molt, they just need a little bit to get on. So you kind of give them that little bit of time and see where it goes from there, really. So kind of reflect on that and basically check whether it works, and if it is working, then either keep it up for a bit to just see how things go, or it might be that they're just going through a growth spurt or a molt and their needs are higher for that period of time, and then see where it goes from there. Yeah, a lot of what I do with rats, there isn't a single right answer. You probably noticed this by now from my videos. There's a lot of different ways of doing it, but a lot of it is try something that's reasonable, that's based on some science, but then watch and see how it goes, because every rat is different. They don't all have the same needs. It's perfectly possible to have a rat in the cage that's out of condition and the other rats in the cage should be in beautiful condition, and that just tells you that rat's needs are slightly different at the moment. So it's something you need to be kind of conscious of. So that's probably it from a coat kind of point of view. Well, it probably isn't. I've probably missed about 1,000 things that I could have said, but I also don't want to ramble on for too long, because I do that, and the girls are out and having a fun time, so I want to join them. So I think it's bye from me for now. Any questions on condition, please let me know. I'm going to try and insert some random photos either into the video or maybe at the end if I'm not particularly organised, and just to show you the kind of things to look out for. I've got some quite good ones on there. Of bad examples, and I might try and get some good examples on there as well. So over and out, and enjoy tweaking your rat's diet to suit their coat condition.